Hello and welcome to my shop. This video is sort of a machine tour of the SCM Minimax 315 ES sliding table saw. I recently took delivery of this machine and I'm starting to put it through its paces. And one thing that frustrated me before plunking down a big amount of cash on this machine is the dearth of information about it. There's a few videos produced by SCM, but one doesn't trust those 100%. And otherwise, there's not a lot of content out there about what the saw actually looks like up front. So I hope that this video will help prospective shoppers for this machine, just by showing them some up-close views of the saw, and especially with regards to how it's calibrated, an important thing with the sliding table saw. So let's get to it. Let's start with the Wagon, as that's probably the most interesting part about this whole machine. I ordered the standard option, which makes it about 10.5 feet long or 3.2 millimeters. Rides on prismatic bearing ways, so there's this diamond-shaped channel on each side of the support column, support piece, and bearings right in here. So it's a pretty heavy piece of steel, but it still slides easy enough. It glides quite nicely. So the Outrigger clamps into these slots. Incidentally, the wide part at the base is 30 millimeters wide with a 15 millimeter wide slot on top. So the Outrigger clamps into this side slot, and its vertical orientation is controlled by a plastic tab that rides in the bottom of the slot. The plastic tab is part of this assembly here. You would adjust the height of the Outrigger by loosening these two guys and then finessing this grub screw here. So there's two of those. The squareness of the Outrigger can't be controlled this way. You would do that by messing with the fence, which is where we'll go next. So on the 315 ES, the Outrigger fence can be mounted in two positions, forward or back, depending on what you're going for. And so there's a fulcrum point here and then a stop point here. So here's, this is the fulcrum point. There's a machine round on this bolt here. And then over on the other side, we have a very fancy lock knob with a machined surface here that is calibrated against. So if I drop down a touch, you'll see down here there is a grub screw, and this meets against this machine face. This is how the squareness of the miter fence is adjusted. And again, there's two of these grub screws, one for forward cutting and one for aft cutting. Now the left and right position of the miter fence is controlled by this simple little inset plate right here. You can see that it gets held into place by these two grub screws smashed against the bottom of the channel. And that is factory set to align the scale of the miter fence with 0 on the saw blade. And amazingly enough, that was dead on out of the box. Let's see, I'm going to flip this over. Okay, so that you can loosen these two lock knobs and store the miter fence all the way slid forward that way, so that you have a little more walking clearance over here. That's a nice touch. And of course, the miter fence, wrong one. The miter fence has an adjustment, or an extendable arm rather, that I think takes it out to, I think 10 foot 5 inches, something like that. Yeah, 125 inches on your miter fence. So on the 315 ES, the standard option are these flip stops with a quite simple stop block here. There's no bubble indicator to more easily see where you're at. However, I'll add that there's a nice machined face. This is where the fence has been calibrated against this machined face. So as you're working and looking over the measurement, it's honestly not too hard to use. I haven't yet found this to be a problem. I'm going to do my best to show you guys how the Wagon calibrates and is attached to the saw body. So the main player here is this rail along the bottom extrusion. This slides onto alignment pins, which have been factory aligned to calibrate the Wagon in a left and right fashion. So here is one of those alignment pins. This is not a bolt. This is basically a metal stud that's been positioned at the factory. And when installing the Wagon, you simply slide this slot on top of that stud. And then this large black bolt here, this one is pre-installed into that same slot, hanging down loose. And then once you and your wife lower the Wagon down onto the saw body, you put on these bolts here and nuts in order to attach it down. So the Wagon's left and right orientation is pre-calibrated at the factory, but if you need to adjust that, you would then loosen this nut way up in here. Good luck finding that, and then you would adjust that alignment pin left and right. Vertical adjustment of the Wagon is performed by these two bolts. So these two bolts, they simply go through threaded holes in the saw chassis, and they just point upwards, and the Wagon via this steel plate rest on top of those two bolts. So as many other machines have the same situation where you adjust the position of the bolt, and then as soon as you tighten the lock nut, the position changes. Great. This one has a second layer of complexities that the position of the Wagon will further change when you cinch down the main fixing nut. So before you do any sort of measuring or checking on adjusting your Wagon's vertical position, you need to tighten both of these, actually all three of these, 1, 2, 3, and then do your checks. One last item to note about the miter fence is the Sacrificial tear-out guard. Shipped, this thing is about 2 inches longer, and the very first time you run the saw, or rather push the miter fence past the spinning saw blade, this gets amputated at the 0 mark. So its purpose is to prevent blowout from the saw blade exiting the wood this way, and it's also a very handy visual guide of where 0 is on your fence. And I'll add that there are 4, the Wagon attaches to the saw chassis in 4 places. There's 4 pairs of these bolts, 1 in the front and back of the T-shaped part of the saw body, and then 2 in the middle closer to the main box. Here's a view of the saw chassis without the Wagon installed. This will let you get a better view of those guide pins that control the left and right orientation of the Wagon. I'll start a tour of the saw body where the action happens in the saw unit. So I have mounted in here a 12-inch blade. The 315 ES has a nod towards us North American woodworkers, and that it has a 1-inch arbor on the main blade. And also, I will also note that the 315 ES does come with a scoring blade. This was pre-installed, but I did take mine out in order to strip off all the shipping grease. I'll pop off the blades to show you how those innards look. Excuse me. So the 315 ES has Dado Support, which is cool. What that means, the arbor is a little bit extra long, and I think that fact forces you to take off the throat plate with each and every blade change. Kind of annoying. but maybe it's not true. Just an observance. So there's six of these bolts. All right. All right, there's the usual. Right. So you use the comedy size, 36 millimeter side. Right. There's a nice big heavy flange. Blade comes off. A funny anecdote about the blade. So this is a Freud industrial blade. It was about $105 on Amazon. So the inside of the blade arbor was painted with the same red paint that's elsewhere on the blade. And when I tried to put it on the very first time, it would not fit. And that's because that paint caused the size of the arbor to be a little bit less than a thou. And I guess this arbor is exactly at 1 thou. So I just took a little bit of sandpaper, cleaned out that paint, and went right in. Pretty cool. All right. So it's nice, big, beefy flange that that the blade sits on. Over here is the scoring blade. I'll pop that off. Takes a 17 mil. All right, so the scoring blade, again, this came with the saw. And there's a little washer here that fits inside the mating flange. And here's the scoring blade arbor. While here, I'll note that the riving knife that's currently installed, this comes with the overhead dust guard. The stock riving knife has a place for the dust guard to clip onto, but the optional dust guard unless you have a sleek looking riving knife. While I'm here, I'll show you the throat plate, secondary throat plate that's included. One would use this while cutting dados with the saw. I have not yet used this. Here's a close-up of how the riving knife mounts. So the riving knife itself has slots in it that allow you unfettered access to the adjustment grub screws on the block. My old Grizzly sliding table saw, bless its metal little heart, would obscure these adjustment grub screws. So you had to remove the entire riving knife each time you wanted to adjust it, and it always came out of an adjustment too. So this one's a slightly better design. There's only 3 of them too, which makes sense because 3 points in a surface will always make contact, whereas my old Grizzly had 4 grub screws, so presumably one would always be a little bit off. So the riving knife mounts onto this L-shaped bracket here, and you can slide around, of course. And the little adjustment screws appear to be brass. Yeah, that's brass. I haven't had to touch this, thankfully, because it came perfect right out of the box. Let's start our tour of the saw body by looking at the raise and lift control and the scoring blade control. So raising and lowering the blade is a simple manual affair. There's no sort of readout. So this guy lowers and raises, and this is a locking for the same lock knob. These 2 little guys are for the scoring blade. This one controls the left and right orientation position of the blade, and this raises and lowers it. This has been factory set to when it's at its maximum height, it's at a suitable height for ripping through or scoring through plywood. Over here is the main power cutoff switch and an emergency. Here is the main control panel of the saw. This saw shares a chassis with the SI 400, so there's blank control spots, even an unused label, but it's simply blade start, scoring blade, and E-stop. An important note that I'll make right here is that the scoring blade cannot be started independently of the main blade. So when I first got this thing wired up, I, of course, tested the main blade, great, and it seemed to me that the scoring blade wasn't working. Well, that's just because you have to start this one, and then only then can you start this one. And shutting off the main blade while both in operation will shut them both. Blade tilt is another manual affair, but this time you get one of those nifty gravity-powered dial indicators. And down here is the locking mechanism for the blade tilt. Continuing around the back, we'll end this saw body tour with a view of the main dust port. So this is a 120 millimeter port, very incompatible with your 4-inch stuff. I'm using a Fernco fitting, this particular one, the 1056-43, to adapt down to 4-inch hose. So this dust port simply bolts onto the bottom of the saw blade enclosure. We'll end our tour of the saw body by looking in the back door. So here's the two motors, main motor and scoring blade. And then way down here is a big chunk of concrete, aka the counterweight, aka the ballast. So this is positioned opposite of the wagon, just to counteract any kind of heavy loads. We'll wrap up with a tour of the electrical side of this machine. As you might know, this saw does not come with a plug, nor does it come with a power cord. So please be prepared to pony up for a power cord. This is a 10 gauge, three conductor cable, aka 10-3. I have it on a 30 amp circuit, hooked up with a locking plug. So your power cable goes in through this port, and then we'll continue up into the main cutoff switch right here. While assembly, you need to remove this whole darn switch in order to install your leads. And then the machine is grounded. This is my shop's ground cable, grounds to the back plane here. So there's a whole litany of relays and such in here. It's quite the arrangement for really only, I think, one cutoff. There's a cutoff for the guard, the door over the blades. But keep in mind that this saw comes in much more complicated variations, so that's probably why all this stuff is here. The rip fence is the usual high-low aluminum extrusion. You can either attach it here or here. And the rip bar is just a piece of round steel that attaches onto both the cast iron top and your steel extension wing. There's not much to say about the fence. The micro adjust is done via a pinion here, which we push down, and then it engages with this rack. The rack goes all the way to the end. It's quite a nice way to do micro adjust. My old saw would only had a limited amount of micro adjust within a certain range, and this works pretty well. I'm pleased with it. Otherwise, here is the idler wheel for the fence body, and this one calibrates up and down just by virtue of clamping onto the casting here. So you loosen this nut, adjust it where you think it needs to go, and then you reef it back down. It's a little bit fussy of a thing to calibrate. The North American version of the 315 ES does come with a number of free free extras or free options, if you will. I'll start with this guy. This is an auxiliary table that clamps into the side rail of the wagon. It's there to support just awkward pieces. Works well. It calibrates both in the up-down position and in its pitch. Secondly is a clamp. It's pretty well made. It's beefy. Not much to say about that. There's a little ripping shoe. Put this at the end of the wagon. You can shove a board under there. Works well. And finally, there's the angle cutting device. Again, this clamps into the side of the wagon. And it's basically just a big miter fence. It's accurate right out of the box. Works quite well, and it even extends out to 65 inches, if you wish. And it comes with two more of these flip-stops. Here's a roundup of the rest of the stuff that comes with the machine. Not pictured, of course, are bags of little metric Allen wrenches and box end wrenches, but that's not that interesting. So here is the stock blade guard. This again has a 60mm port on it, and this is the stock riving knife, of course, clipped out to fit into there. There's a little pusher handle in case you want to make a push block, and there's the instruction manual, parts list, and an electrical diagram. Get your readers out for the instruction manual. It's printed 2 pages per sheet. I guess they wanted to save some paper at some point. And so some of the more detailed diagrams have little parts that are indecipherable. So you just kind of have to look at the machine and try to retranslate the English to see what's happening. I'll spend a minute on the optional overarm dust guard. This is the one optional thing I bought with the machine. I think it was an extra $800 or $900. It's pretty nice, but that's a nice chunk of money. So it attaches to the cast iron top and end of the ripping table. And it's basically a big letter C, letting you use the full width of the ripping table. And it, of course, adjusts up and down. So at the moment, I have it set up for straight blade orientation, but it comes with an additional hood that clips in here in case you're using the blade at an angle. So as you can see, the whole arm will swing out of the way in case you're doing something like blade changes. The dust port here is 80 millimeters. That differs from the stock blade guard, which has a 60mm port. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. I know that there's no way I covered every single aspect about this machine, so if you have anything that you're wondering about it, leave a comment or a question down below, and I'll be happy to answer it. Thanks for watching.